Chapter 1. I am, by birth, a Genetsky, and my family is one of the most distinguishable of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years councillors and syndicates, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public business. He passed his younger days potentially occupied by the fairness of his country. A variety of circumstances that prevented him from marrying early, nor was it until the decline of life that he became a husband and the father of a family. As the circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character, I cannot refrain from relating them. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who, from the flowering state, fell through numerous mischances into poverty. This man, whose name was Bedford, was of a proud and unbending disposition, and could not bear to live in poverty and oblivion in the same country where he had formerly been distinguished for his rank and magnificence. Having paid his debts, therefore, in the most honorable manner, he retreated with his daughter to the town of Lawrence, where he lived unknown in the wretchedness. My father loved Bedford with the truest friendship, and was deeply grieved by his retreat in these unfortunate circumstances. He bitterly deplored the false pride which led his friend to conduct so little worthy of affection that united them. He lost no time in endeavoring to seek him out, with the hope of persuading him to begin the world again through his credit and assistance. Bedford had taken effectual measures to conceal himself, and it was 10 months before my father discovered his abode. Overjoyed at this discovery, he hastened to the house, which his situation in Mean Street near the ruins. But he entered, misery and despair alone welcomed him. Bedford had saved but a very small sum of money from the wreck of his fortunes, but it was sufficient to provide him with sustenance for some months, and in the meantime he hoped to procure some respectable employment in a merchant's house. The interval was, consequently, spent in inaction. His grief only became more deep and ranking when he had leisure for reflection, and at length it took so fast the hold of his mind that in the end of 3 months he lay on a bed of sickness, incapable of any exertion. His daughter attended him with the greatest tenderness, and she saw with despair that their little fund was rapidly decreasing, and that there was no other prospect of support. But Caroline Bedford possessed a mind of an uncommon mould, and her courage rose to support her in her adversity. She procured plain work, she plaited straw, and by various means contrived to earn a pittance scarcely sufficient for a support life. Several months passed in this manner. Her father grew worse. Her time was more entirely occupied in tending him. Her means of sustenance decreased, and in the 10th month her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and a beggar. This last blow overcame her, and she knelt before Bedford's coffin, weeping bitterly. When my father entered the chamber, he came, like a prospecting spirit, to the poor girl, who committed herself to his care, and, after the entertainment of his friend, conducted her to Galivia, and placed her under protection of a relation. 2 years after this event, Caroline became his wife. There was a considerable difference between the ages of my parents, but this circumstance seemed to unite them only closer in bonds of devotion, affection. There was a sense of justice in my father's upright mind, which rendered it necessary that he would approve highly to love strongly. Perhaps during former years he had suffered from the late discovered unworthiness of one beloved, and so was disposed to set a greater value on the tried worth. There was a show of gratitude and worship in his attachment to my mother, differing wholly from the doting fondness of age, for it was inspired by reverence for her virtues, and a desire by the means of, in some degree, recompensing her for the sorrows she had endured, but with a grave, inexpressible grace to his behaviour to her. Everything was made to yield her wishes and her caprice. He strove to shelter her, as a fair intoxic is sheltered by a gardener, from every rougher winter. and to surround her with all that could tend to exploit pleasure emotion in her soft, benevolent mind. Her health, and even tranquillity of her hitherto constant spirit, had been shaken by what she had gone through. During 2 years she had elapsed previous to their marriage, my father had gradually relinquished all of his public functions. Immediately after their union, they sought the pleasant climate of Italy, and the change of scene and interest attendant on a tour through the land of wonders, as a restorative for her weakened frame. From Italy they visited Germany and France. I, their eldest child, was born in Naples, and, as an infant accompanying them in their rambles, I remained for several years their only child. Much as they're attached to each other, they seem to draw inexhaustible stores of affection from a very mine of love to bestow them upon me. My mother's tender caresses and my father's smile of benevolent pleasure while regarding me are my first recollections. I was their plaything and their idol, and something better, their child, the innocent, helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven, whom to bring up good, and whose fortune lot in their hands, to direct to happiness or misery, according as they fulfilled their duties towards me. With this deep consciousness of what they owed towards a being to which they had given life, added to the active spirit of tenderness, it animated both. It may be imagined that while during every hour of my infant life I received a lesson of patience, of charity, and of self-control, I was so guided by a second chord that all seemed but one train of enjoyment to me. For a long time I was their only care. Mother much desired to have a daughter, but I continued their single offspring. When I was about 5 years old, while making an excursion beyond my frontiers of Italy, they passed a week on the shores of Lake Como. Their benevolent disposition often made them enter the cottages of the poor. This, to my mother, was more than a duty. It was a necessity, a passion, remembering what she had suffered, and how she had been relieved. For her to act in her turn, the guardian angel to the afflicted. During one of their walks, a poor cot in the foldings of a vale attracted their notice, and was being singularly discreet, while the number of half-clothed children gathered about it spoke of penury in its worst shape. One day, when my father had gone by himself to Milan, my mother, accompanied by me, visited this abode. She found a peasant and his wife, hard-working, bent down by care and labor, distributed a scaly meal to 5 hungry babies. Among these were which attracted my mother. Far above all the rest, she appeared to have a different stock. The 4 others were dark-eyed, hardly little vagrants. Their child was thin and very fair. Her hair was the brightest living gold. Despite the poverty of her clothing, seemed to have set a crown of distinction upon her head. Her brow was clear and ample, her blue eyes cloudless, and her lips the moulding of her face so expressive of sensibility and sweetness that none could behold without looking on her as of a distant species, a being heaven sent, and bearing a celestial stamp in all her features. The peasant woman, receiving my mother's fixed eyes of wonder and admiration on this lovely girl, eagerly communicated her history. She was not her child, but she was the daughter of a Milanese nobleman. Her mother was a German that had died on giving her birth. The infant had been placed with these good people to nurse. They were better off then. They had been long married, and their eldest child was but just born. The father of their charge was one Italian's nurse in the memory of the acquainted glory of Italy, one among the Scaglioli Frementi, who had exerted himself to obtain the liberty of his country. He became the victim of its weakness. Whether he had died or still lingered in the dungeons of Australia was not known. His property was confiscated. His child became an orphan and a beggar. She continued with her foster parents and bloomed in their rude abode, fairer than a garden rose upon the dark-leaved brambles. When my father returned from Milan, he found playing with me in the hall of our villa a child fairer than a picture cherub, a creature who seemed to shred radiance from her looks and whose form motions were lighter than the camelons of the hills. The apparition was soon explained. With his permission, my mother prevailed on her rustic gardens to yield charge to her. They were found of the sweet orphan. Her presence had seemed a blessing to them, but it would be unfair to keep her in poverty and want them Providence afford her such powerful protection. They consulted their village priest, and the result was that Elizabeth Lanza became the imminent of my parents' house, more than my sister, my beautiful and adored companion of all my occupations and my pleasures. Everyone loved Elizabeth. The passionate and almost reverential attachment with which all regarded her became, while I shared it, my pride and my delight. On the evening previous to her being brought to my home, my mother had said playfully, "I have a pretty present for my Victor. Tomorrow we shall have it." And when, on the morrow, she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally, and took upon Elizabeth as mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed on her I received was made to a possession of my own. We called each other family by name of cousin. No word, no expression could body forth the kind of resolution which she stood to me. My more than sister, since still death she was to be mine only. Chapter 2. We were brought up together. There was not quite a year difference in our ages. I need not say we were strangers to any species of disunion or dispute. Harmony was the soul of our companionship, and the diversity and contrast that subsisted in our characters drew us nearer together. Elizabeth was of a calmer, more concentrated disposition, but with all I adore, I was capable of more intense application, and was more deeply smitten with thirst for knowledge. She bruised herself with following of aerial creations of the poets, and the majestic wonders of scenes which surrounded our Swiss home. The sublime shapes of the mountains, the changes of the seasons, tempest and calm, the silence of winter, the life and turbulence of our alpine summers. She found ample scope for admiration and delight, while my companion contemplated with the serious and satisfied spirit the magnificent appearances of things. I delighted in investigating their causes. The world was to me a secret which I desired to divine. Curiosity, earnest research to learn the hidden laws of nature, gladness akin to rapture, they were unfolded to me, are among the earliest sensations I can remember. On the birth of a second son, my junior, by 7 years, my parents gave up entirely their wandering life, and fixed themselves in their native country. We were possessed a house in Gavina, and a campage on Bell Drive, the eastern shore of the lake. At the distance of rather more than a league away from city, we resided partly in the latter, and the lives of my parents were plausible in considerable seclusion. It was my temper to avoid a crowd, and to attach myself fervently to a few. I was indifferent, therefore, to my schoolfellows in general, but I united myself in the bonds of the closest friendship to one among them, Henry Clevel, son of a merchant, Gona. He was a boy of similar talent and fancy. He loved enterprise, hardship, and even danger for its own sake. He was deeply read in books of chivalry and romance. He composed heroic songs and began to write many tales of enchantment and knightly adventure. He tried to make us act plays, and to enter into masquerades in which the characters were drawn from heroes of romances, of the Round Table of King Arthur, and the chivalrous train, who shed their blood to redeem the holy spectre from the hands of the infidels. No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself. My parents were possessed by the very spirit of kindness and indulgence. We felt that they were not the tyrants to rule our lot according to their caprice, but the agents and creators of all many delights which we enjoyed. When I mingled with other families, I distinctly discerned how peculiarly fortunate my lot was. The gratitude assisted the development of female love. My temper was sometimes violent, and my passions vehement, but by some law it was my temper they were turned towards childish pursuits, but an eager desire to learn, and the to learn all things indiscriminately. I confess that neither of the structured languages, nor the code of governments, nor the politics of various states possessed attractions to me. It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn, and whether it was the outward substance of things, the inner spirit of nature, and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me. Still, my inquiries were directed to the mental psychology, or, in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world. Meanwhile, Crevel occupied himself, so to speak, with the moral relations of things, the busy stage of life, the virtues of heroes, the actions of men were his theme, and his hope and his dream was to become one among those whose names were recorded in story as gallant and adventurous, benefactors of our species. The sanity soul of Elizabeth shone like a shrine dedicated lamp to our peaceful home. Her sympathy was ours. Her smile, her soft voice, the sweet glance of her celestial eyes were ever there to bless and animate us. She was the living spirit of love to soften and attract. I might have become sullen in my study, rough through the armor of my nature, but that she was there to subdue me in semblance of her own gentleness. And Travel, well, I ill entrenched the noble spirit of Travel. Yet he might not have been so perfectly humane, so thoughtful in his generosity, so full of kindness and tenderness amidst his passion for adventurous exploit, had she not unfolded to him the real loveliness of benefits and made good doing the end and aim of his soaring ambition. I feel exquisite pleasure in dwelling on the recollections of childhood, before misfortune had tainted my mind and changed its bright visions of extensive useless into gloomy and narrow reflections upon self. Besides, in drawing the picture of my early days, I also record those events which led my insensible steps to my after tale of misery. For when I would account myself for the birth of that passion which afterwards ruled my destiny, I find it arise, like a mountain river, from indulgent and the most forgotten sources, but swelling as it proceeded, it became the torrent which, in its cause, was swept away with all my hopes and joys. Natural physiology, as genius that resoluted my fate, I desire, therefore, in this narration to state this fact which led my predilection for the science when I was 13 years of age. We went on a party of pleasure to the baths near Theron. The inclement of the weather obligated us to remain a day confined to the inn. In this house I chanced to find a volume of the works of Collinius Appigenia. I opened it with apathy. The theory which he attempts to demonstrate, and the wonderful facts which he relates, soon changed this feeling to enthusiasm. I knew light seemed to draw upon my mind, and, bounding with new joy, I commuted my discovery to my father. My father looked curiously at the title page of my book, and said, "Ah, Cornelius Appigeia, my dear Victor, do not waste your time upon this. It is a sad trash." If, instead of this remark, my father had taken the pains to explain to me the principles of Appigeia, and had been entirely explained that a modern system of science had been introduced which possessed a greater powers than the ancient, because the powers of the latter were chimerical, while those of the former were real and practical. Under such circumstances, I should certainly have thrown Apocrypha aside, and have contented in my imagination, warmed as it was, by returning with greater ardor to my former studies. It was even possible that the train of my ideas would never have received the fatal impulse that led to my ruin, but the curiosity glance my father had taken of my volume by no means assured me that he was acquainted with its contents, and I continued to read with greatest availability. When I returned home, my first care was to procure the whole works of this author, and afterwards of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild fancies of these writers with delight. They appeared to me treasures known to few besides myself. I have described myself as always having been imbued with the fervent longing to penetrate the secrets of nature, In spite of these intense labor and wonderful discoveries of modern philosophers, I always came from my studies discovered and unsatisfied. Sir Isaac Newton is said to have avowed that he felt like a child picking up shells beside the great and unexplored ocean of truth. Those of his successors in each branch of natural physiology, with whom I was acquainted, appeared, even to my boy's apprehensions, as tyros engaged in the same pursuit. The untaught peasant beheld the elements around him, and was acquainted with their practical uses. The most learned philosopher knew little more. He had partially unveiled the face of nature, but her moral lineaments were still a wonder and mystery. He might dissect atomos and give names, but not to speak of a final cause. Causes in their secondary and tertiary grades, and were utterly unknown to him. I have grazed upon the fortifications and impediments that seem to keep the human beings from entering the citadel of nature, and rashly, ignorantly, I had repined. But there were books, and here were men who had penetrated deeper and knew more. I took their word for all that they arrived, and I became their disciple. It may appear strange that such should arise in the 18th century, but while I followed the routine of education in the schools of Geneva, I was, to a great degree, self-taught in the regard for my favorite studies. My father was not scientific, and I was left to struggle with a child's blindness, added to a student's thirst for knowledge. Under the guidance of my new preceptors, I entered with the greatest diligence into the search of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. The latter soon obtained my undivided attention. Wealth was an inferior object, but what glory would attend the discovery if I would banish disease from the human frame, and render man invulnerable to any but a violent death? Nor were these my only visions. The raising of ghosts or devils, as a promise liberally accorded my favorite authors, the fulfillment of which I eagerly sought, and if my inclinations were always unsuccessful, I attributed the failure rather to my own inexperience and mistake than a want of skill or fidelity with my instructors, and thus, for a time, I was occupied by exploding systems mingling like an unadapt, 1,000 contradictory theories, and floundering desperately in the very slot of multifarious knowledge, guided by the ardent imagination and childish reasoning, till an accident again changed the current of my ideas. When I was about 15 years old, we had retired to our house near Bellerive, when we witnessed the most violent and most terrible thunderstorm. It advanced from behind the mountains of Jura. The thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various corners of the heavens. I remained, while the storm lasted, watching its progress with curiosity and delight. As I stood at the door, on a sudden I beheld a stream of fire issued from an old and beautiful oak, which stood about 20 yards from our house, and as soon as the dazzling light vanquished, the oak had disappeared, and nothing remained but a blasted stump. When we visited the next morning, we found the tree shattered in a singular manner. It was not splintered by the shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. I never beheld anything so utterly destroyed. Before this, I was not unacquainted with the more obvious laws of electricity. This far occasion, a man of great research in natural philosophy was with us, and, excited by this catastrophe, he entered the explanation of a theory which he had formed the subject of electricity and galvanization, which was once new and astonishing to me. All that he said threw greatly into the shape of Cornelius, Africa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, the lords of my imagination. But by some faculty, the overthrow of these men disinclined me to pursue my accustomed studies. We seemed to me as if nothing or could ever be known. All that had been so long engaged my attention suddenly grew despicable. By one of those capillaries of the mind which are perhaps the most subject to in early youth. I at once gave up my former occupations, set down the natural history in all its progeny as a deformed and abortive creation, and entertained the greatest disdain, for it would be science which would never even step within the threshold of real knowledge. In this mood of mind, I betook myself to the mathematics and the branches of study application to so that science as being built upon secure foundations is so worthy of my consideration. Thus strangely are our souls constructed, and by such sight ligaments we are bound to his prosperity or ruin. When I look back, it seems to me that if thus is almost miraculous change of inclination, and the will was immediate suggestion by the guardian angel of my life. The last effort made by the spirit of preservation to avert the storm that had even then hanging in the stars and ready to envelop me. Her victory was announced by an unusual tranquillity and gladness of soul which followed the relinquishing of my ancient and latter tormenting studies. It was, thus, that was to be taught to associate evil with their prosecution, happiness with their disregard. It was a strong effort, the spirit of good, but it was ineffectual. Destiny was too potent in her immeasurable laws, and decreed my utter and terrible destruction. Chapter 3. When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt, as I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva. But my father thought it necessary for me, the completion of my education, that I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was severe, and she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, many arguments have been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favourite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. She attended her sick bed, her watchful attentions triumphant over the malady of the distemper. Elizabeth was saved, but the consequences of this immature were fatal to her preserver. On the third day her mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticated the worst event. On her deathbed, the fortune and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. My children, she said, my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply your place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you, and, happy and beloved as I have been, it is not hard to quit you all. But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge in hope of meeting you in another world. She died calmly. Her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest eyes are rent by the most imperishable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul, and the despair that it exhibits on the countenance. It was so long before the mind could persuade itself that she whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared a part of our own, could have departed forever, that the brightness of our beloved eye could have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice so familiar and dear to the ear can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days, but when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not that rude hand run away from dear connection? And why should I describe a sorrow which I have felt, and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, although it was it may be deemed a sacrilege, it is not banished. My mother was dead, but we had still duties which we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest, and learn to think ourselves fortunate whilst one remains whom the spoiler was not seized. My departure for Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained my father a respite of some weeks. It appeared to me sacrilege so soon to leave the repose, akin to death, of the house of mourning and rush into the thick of life. I was new to sorrow, but it did not less alarm me. I was unwilling to quit the sight of those that remained to me, and above all, I desired to see my sweet Elizabeth in some degree consoled. She indeed reeled in her grief, and strove to act comfort to us all. She looked steadily on life, and assuming its duties with courage and zeal. She devoted herself to those whom she had taught to call her uncle and cousins. Never was she so enchanting as at this time, when she recalled the sunshine of her smiles and spent them upon us. She forgot even her own regret in her endeavors to make us forget. The day of my departure at length arrived. Colonel spent the last evening with us. He had endeavored to persuade his father to permit him to accompany me and become my fellow student, but in vain. His father was a narrow-minded trader, and saw idleness and ruin in the aspirations and ambition of his son. Henry deeply felt the misfortune of being debarred from a little education. He said little, but when he spoke, I read in his kindling eye, and in his animating glance, a restrained but firm resolve not to be chained to the miserable details of commerce. We sat late. We could not tear ourselves away from each other, nor persuade ourselves to say the word farewell. It was said, retired under the presence of seeking repose, each fancying that the other was deceived. But when the morning's dawned, I descended into the carriage, which was to convey me away. We were all there, my father again to bless me, Clerval to press my hand once more, my Elizabeth to renew her entreaties, that I would write often, and to bestow the last feminine attentions on her playmate and friend. I threw myself into the chaise and was to convey me away, and indulge in the most melancholy reflection. I, who never been surrounded by animal companions, continuously engaged in endeavoring to bestow mutual pleasure. I was now alone. In the university whither I was going, I must form my own friends, and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to my new countenance. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey. But I was preceded, my spirits and hopes rose. I evidently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it had to remain during my youth, cooped up in one place, and longed to enter the world and take my station among other human beings. Now, my desires were completed with, and it would, indeed, have been folly to repent. I had sufficient leisure for these and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. At length, the high white steeple of my solitary apartment, to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted opulent sway over me from the moment I turned my relucent steps from my father's door, led me first to M. Kempery, professor of natural physiology. He was an uncouth man, but deeply imbued in the secrets of his science. He asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science I pertain to natural physiology. I replied carelessly, and partly in contempt, mentioning the names of my alchemists as the principal authors I had studied. The professor stared. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time in studying such nonsense?" I replied in the affirmative. "Every minute," continued M. Kempenworth. "Every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly entirely lost. You have burned your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies which you have so greedily imbibed are 1,000 years old, and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected in the enlightenment and scientific age, and to find disciple of Albertus Magnus and Flacius. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew." So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating of natural physiology, which he had desired me to procure, and dismissing me after mentioning that in the beginning of the following week he intended to commence in the course of lectures upon natural physiology and its general relations, and that M. Waldman, a fellow professor, would lecture upon chemistry in the alternate days that he admitted. I returned home not disappointed, for I have said I have long considered those authors useless whom the professor reported, but I returned not at all the more inclined to recur these studies in any shape. M. Kempenworth was a little squat man with a gruff voice and repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not propose me in favor of his pursuits, or rather into physiological, and connected a strain. Perhaps I have given an account of the conclusions I had come to concerning them in my early years. As a child, I had not been procreated with the results promised by modern professors of the natural science, with a confusion of ideas only to be accounted for my extreme youth and my want of a guide for such matters. I had retrodden the steps of knowledge along the paths of time, and exchanged the discoveries of recent inquiries, the dreams of forgotten alchemists. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural physiology. It was very different when the masters of science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions, on which my interest in science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. Such were my reflections during the first 2 or 3 days of my residence at Inglis, which were chiefly spent in becoming acquainted with the localities of the principal residents in my new abode. But as the ensuing week commenced, I thought of the information which M. Kempenworth had given me concerning the lectures, and, although I could not consent to go and to hear that little conceited fellow deliver sentences out of a pulpit, I recollected what he had said of Men Waldman, whom I had never seen, as he had hitherto been out of town. Partly from curiosity and partly from idleness, I went into the lecturing room, which M. Waldman entered shortly after. This professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, but with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few gray hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His person was short, but remarkably erect, and his voice was the sweetest I had ever heard. He began his lecture by the recapitulation of the history of chemistry, and the various improvements made by differences of men, learning, pronouncing with fervor the names of the most distinguishable discoverers. He then took a curious view of the present state of the science, and explained many of its elementary terms. After having made a few preparatory experiments, he concluded with panegyric upon modern chemistry, the terms of which I shall never forget. The ancient teachers of this science, said he, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted, and that the elixir of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seemed only made to dabble in dirt, and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature, and show how she works in her hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They have commanded the thunders of heaven, mimicked earthquake, and even mocked the invisible world with its own shadows. Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such words of fate announced to destroy me. As he went on, I felt as if my soul were grappling with the falsifiable enemy. One by one the various keys were touched, which formed the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind is filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much was done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. More, far more, will I achieve, treading in the steps already marked. I will pioneer a new way, explore the unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. I closed not my eyes that night. My internal being was in a state of insecretion and turmoil. I felt that order would thence arise, but I had no power to produce it. By degrees, after the morning's dawn, sleep came. I awoke, and my yesternight's thoughts were as a dream. There only remained a solution to return to my ancient studies, and devote myself to a science for which I believed myself to possess a natural talent. On the same day, I paid M. Waldman a visit. His manners in private were even more mild and attractive than in public, for there was a certain dignity in his mien during his lecture, which in his own house was replaced by greatest affability and kindness. I gave him pretty nearly the same account of my former pursuits as I had given to his fellow professor. He heard with attention the little narrative concerning my studies, and smiled at the names of Cornelius, Epigena, and Paracelsus, and without the contempt that M. Compre had exhibited. He said that these were men to whose indefatigable zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundations of their knowledge. They had left to us, as an easier task, to give new names and arrange connecting classifications, the facts at which, in a great degree, had been instruments in bringing to light. The labors of men of geniuses, however earnestly directed, scarcely ever fail in unlimitedly turning to the solid advantage of mankind. I listened to his statement, which he was delivered without precipitation or affectation, and then added his lecture and removed my prejudices upon modern chemists. I expressed myself in measured terms, with the modesty and deference due from the youth of his instructor, without letting escape inexperiences in life would have made me ashamed, any of the enthusiasm which stimulated my intended labors. I requested his advice concerning the books I ought to produce. I am happy, said M. Waldman, to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your ability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is that brand of natural physiology in which the greatest improvements have been made and may be made. It is that account that I have made in my peculiar study, but at the same time I have not neglected the other branches of science. A man would make but a very sorry chemist if he attended to the departure of human knowledge alone. If you wish to become really a man of science, and not merely a petty experimentalist, you should advise to apply every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics. He then took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines, instructing me as to what I ought to procure and promising me the use of his own, when I sought to have advanced far enough in the science not to derange their mechanism. He also gave me the list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me. I deceived my future destiny. Chapter 4. From this day, natural philosophy and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor those works so full of geniuses and discrimination which modern inquirers have written on these subjects. I attended the lectures and cultivated the acquaintance of the men of science of the university. I found even in Mr. Kemp a great deal of sound sense. The real information combined, it is true, with the repulsive physiognomy and manners, but not on account the less valuable. In M. Waldman I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tinged by dogmatism, and his instructions were given with an air of frankness and good nature that banished every idea of pedantry. In a thousand ways he soothed me for the path of knowledge and made the most abstruse inquiries clear and faithful to my apprehension. My application was at first fluctuating and uncertain. It gained strength as I proceeded, and soon became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in my light of morning whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. As I applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that my progress was rapid. My ardor was indeed the astonishment of the students, and my proficiency that of the masters. Professor Kempery often asked me, with a sly smile, how Cornelius Apogena went on. All is my progress. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but disengaged heart and soul in the pursuit of some discoveries, which I hope to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive the enticements of science. In other studies, you may go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit there is continual food for discovery and wonder. A mind of moderate capacity, which closely pursued one study, must infallibly arrive at a great proficiency in that study, and I, who continually sought the attainment of one subject of pursuit, insolently wrapped up in this, improved so rapidly that at the end of 2 years I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me a great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point, and become as well acquainted with the theory and practice in natural physiology, I departed on the lessons of any of the professors at English, my residence there being no longer conducive to my improvement. I thought of returning to my friends in my native town, when an incident happened that procreated my stay. One of the pneumonia, which had peculiarly attracted my attention, was the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal alluding with life, whence I often asked myself, when the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which was never considered as a mystery. Yet with how many things we were upon the brink of becoming acquainted! If cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries, I resolved these circumstances in my mind, and determined thenceforth to apply myself more appreciately to those branches of natural physiology with related psychology. Useless I had been animated by the most supernatural enthusiasm, by appreciation of the study, would have been irksome and almost intolerable to examine the causes of life. We must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of autonomy, but this is not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not even remember the tale of superstition, or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy. The churchyard was to me merely a recapitule of bodies deprived of life, which, being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worm. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. My attention was fixed upon every object most inseparable to the deliberacy of human feelings. I saw how fine for a man was degraded and wasted. I felt corruption of death succeeding to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited in the wonders of the eye and brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the miniature cautions in exempt life, in change of life to death, and death to life, until from the midst of this darkness a sudden light broke in upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple, that while I became dizzy with the immerence of prospect which it illuminated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius who had directed their inquiries towards the same science, that I alone should reserve to discover so astonishing a secret. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman. The sun does not more clearly shine in the heavens, that then, which I now affirm is true. Some miracle might have preceded it, yet strangeness of discovery were distinct and probable. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation of life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. The sentiment which I had first experimented in discovery soon gave place to delight and rapture. After so much time spent in painful labor to arrive at once at the summit of my desires was almost gratifying consummation of my toils. But this discovery was so great and overwhelming that all the steps which I had been progressively led to it were obliterated, and I beheld only the result. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world now was within my grasp. Not that, like magic seen, it was all open upon me at once. The information I had obtained was of a nature rather to direct my endeavors. So soon I should point them towards the object of my search, than to exhibit the object already accomplished. I was like the Arabian, who had buried with the dead and found a passage to life, aided only by one glimmering and seemingly ineffectual light. I see, by your eagerness, and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed with a secret which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am reserved upon that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I then was, to your destruction and infallible misery. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to the world, he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. When I found so astonishing a power placed within my hands, I hesitated a long time concerning the manner in which I should employ it. Although I possessed the capacity of bestowing animation, yet I prepared a frame for the representation of it, with all the intricacies and fibers, muscles, and veins, still remaining a work of inconceivable difficulty and labor. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself, or one of simpler organization, but my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me doubt to my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wonderful as man. The materials at present within my command hardly appeared adequate to so absurd undertaking, but I doubted not that I untimely succeeded. I prepared myself for a multitude of reserves. My operations might be incessantly baffled, and at last my work be imperfect. Yet I considered the improvement which every day takes place in science and mechanics. I was encouraged to hope my present attempts would at least lay the foundations of future success, nor could I consider the magnitude and complexity of my plan as my argument of its impracticability. It was with these feelings that I began creation of a human being, as the minuteness of the parts formed a great hidden being, as the distance to my speed. I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature, that is to say, about 8 feet in height, and proportionally large after having formed his determination and having spent some months in successfully collecting and arranging my materials, I began. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards. Like a hurricane, in the first enthusiasm of success, life and death appeared to me in ideal bounds, which I should first break through, and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me, as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might, in process of time, although I now found it impossible, renew a life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. These thoughts supported my spirits, while I pursued my undertaking with unremittent ardor. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes, at the very brink of certainty, I failed, yet I still clung to the hope which the next day or the next hour might realize. One secret which I alone possessed was the hope to which I had dedicated myself, and the moon glazed on my midnight labors. A while, with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness, I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall see the horrors of my secret toil, as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave, or tortured the living animals to animate the lifeless clay? My limbs now tremble and my eyes swim with the remembrance, but then a restlessness and almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. It was indeed but one passing trance that only made me feel with renewed acuteness as soon as the unnatural stimulus ceased to operate. I had soon returned to my old habits. I collected bones from charnel houses, and disturbed, I, with profane fingers, the tremendous secrets of the human frame, in solitary chamber, or rather cell at top of house, separated from other apartments by a gallery and staircase. I kept my workshop of filthy creation. My eyeballs were starting from their sockets, and attending to the details of my employment. The dissection room and the slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials, and often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation. While this, still urged on by the eagerness, which perpetually increased, I brought my work near to a conclusion. The summer months passed while I thus engaged heart and soul in one pursuit. It was almost a beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield more luxurious vintage. But my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature. And the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to regret those friends who were so miles absent, and whom I had not seen for so long a time. I knew my silence disquieted them, and I well remember the words of my father. I know that while you are pleased with yourself, you will think of us with affection, and we shall hear regularly from you. You must pardon me if I regard any interruption in your correspondence as a proof that your other duties are equally neglected. I knew well, therefore, that would be my father's feelings, but I could not tear my thoughts from my employment, loathsome in itself, but which had taken the irresistible hold of my imagination. I wished, as it were, to procrastinate all that related to my feelings of affection, until the great object, which swallowed up every habit of my nature, should be completed. I then thought that my father would be unjust if he ascribed my neglect to voice to faultiness on my part, but I am now convinced that he was justified in conceiving that I should not be allowed free from blame. A human being imperfect ought to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never allow passion or transitory desire to disturb his tranquillity. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to that rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections, and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, Then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting a human mind. If this rule always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquillity of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would not have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. But I forget that I am moralizing in the most interesting part of my tale, and your looks remind me to proceed. My father made no reproach in his letters, and only took notice of my silence by inquiring into my occupations, more partially than before. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors, but I did not watch the blossom or the expanding leaves, the sights of which before always yielded me supreme delight. So deeply was I engrossed in my occupation, the leaves of that year had withered before my work drew near to a close, and now every day showed me more plainly how well I succeeded. But my enthusiasm was checked by my anxiety, and I apparently rather liked one doomed by slavery to turmoil in the mines or other unwholesome trade than an artist occupied in his favorite employment. Every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to an almost painful degree. The fall of a leaf startled me, and I shunned my fellow creatures, as if I had been guilty of a crime. Sometimes I grew alarmed at the wreck I perceived that I had become. The energy of my purpose alone sustained me. My labors would soon end, and I believed that exercise and amusement would then drive away insistent disease, and promised myself both of these when my creation should be completed. Chapter 5. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the most accomplished of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, and I might infuse the spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 in the morning. Rain pattered dismally against the plains, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. Its breath hardened, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delighted the wretch whom such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form. His limbs were in proportion, and I selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of his muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of purely whiteness, but these luxuries only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost the same color as the dun white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life were not changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation, but now I was finished. The beauty of a dream vanished. The breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured. I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness, but it was in vain. I slept indeed, but it was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth, in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Islip. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but I was imprinted the first kiss of her lips, and they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grey worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead. My teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed, when, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may have been called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened. He muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I had inhabited. There I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching the fearing each sound as it were announced the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oh, no mortal could support the horror that commenced. A mummy again, imbued with animation that could not be so hideous as that wretch. I had gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when these muscles and joints were regenerated, capable of motion, it became a thing even such Deontay could not have conceived. I passed the night wretchedly. Sometimes my pulse beat so quickly and hardly that I felt the palpitation of every artery. At others, I nearly sank to the ground through languor and extreme weakness. Mingled with this horror, I felt the bitterness of disappointment. Dreams that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space were now became hell to me, and the change was so rapid to overthrow so complete. Morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned discovered to my sleepiness, aching eyes in church of Isis, its white steeple and clock, which indicated the 6th hour. The porter opened the gates of the court, which at night had been my asylum. I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps, as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I had feared every turning of the street would present to my view. I did not dare return to the apartment which I inhabited, but felt impelled to hurry on. Although drenched by rain which poured from a black and comfortless sky, I continued walking in this manner for some time, endeavoring by bodily exercise to ease the load that weighed upon my mind. I traversed the streets without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing. My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried on in irregular steps, not daring to look about me. Like one that on the lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and turns no more on his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth claim behind him tread. Continuing thus, I came at length opposite to the inn, at which the various diligences carriages usually stopped. Here I paused. I knew not why, but remained some minutes with my eyes fixed on a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street. As it drew nearer, I observed it was from the Swiss diligence. It stopped just where I was standing. On the door behind, I perceived Henry Campbell, who, on seeing me, instantly sprung out. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed he, "how glad I am to see you! How fortunate that you should be here at the very moment my alighting! Nothing would equal my delight to seeing Campbell. His presence brought back to my thoughts of my father, Elizabeth, and all the scenes of my home, so dear to my recollection. I grasped his hand, and in a moment forgot my horror and misfortune. I felt suddenly, for the first time during many months, calm and sincere joy. I welcomed my friend. Therefore, in the most cordial manner, we walked towards my college. Carroll continued talking for a good time about our mutual friends and his own good fortune in being permitted to come to Iglesist. "You may easily believe," said he, "how great was the difficulty persuading my father that all necessary knowledge was not comprised in the noble art of bookkeeping, and indeed I believed I left him incredulous to the last, for his contrast answer to my unwearied entries was the same as that the Dutch schoolsman entered in the Victor Wakefield. I have 10,000 florins a year without Greek. I eat heartily without Greek, but his affection for me at length overcome his dislike of learning, and he permitted me to undertake a voyage of discovery to a land of knowledge. It gives me the greatest delight to see you, but tell me how you left my father, brothers, and Elizabeth." "Very well, very happy, only little one uneasy. but they hear from you so seldom. But and by and the by, I mean to lecture you and a little upon their account myself. But, my dear Frankenstein, continued he, stopping short and gazing full in my face, I did not before remark how very ill you appear. So thin and pale, you look as though you've been watching for several nights. You have guessed right. I have been so deeply engaged in one occupation that I have not allowed myself sufficient rest, as you see. But I hope, sincerely, that these employments are now at the end, and I am at length free. I trembled excessively. I could not endure to think of, and far less allude to, the occurrences of preceding night. I walked with quick pace, and was soon right at my college. I then reflected, the thought made me shiver, that the creature whom I had left in my apartment might still be there, alive and walking about. I dreaded to behold this monster, but I feared still more that Henry would see him. Entreating him, therefore, to remain a few minutes at the bottom of the stairs, I turned to look towards my own room. My hand was already unlocked the door before I recollected myself. I then paused, and a cold shivering came over me. I threw the door forcibly open, as children were accustomed to do when they expected a spectre to stand and waiting for them on the other side. But nothing appeared. I stepped fearfully in. The apartment was empty, and my bedroom was all free from its hideous guest. I could hardly believe that so great a good fortune could have befallen me, but when I became less assured that my enemy had indeed fled, I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Treble. We ascended into my room, and the servant presently brought breakfast. But I was unable to contain myself. It was not joy only that possessed me. I felt my flesh tingle with excess of sensitiveness. My pulse beat rapidly. I was unable to remain in a single instant in the same place. I jumped over the chairs, clapped my hands, and laughed aloud. Clerval at first attributed my unusual spirits to joy on his arrival, but when he observed me more attentively, he saw the wildness in my eyes, for which he could not account, and my loud, unrestrained, heartless laughter frightened and astonished him. My dear Victor, cried he, what, for God's sake, is the matter? Do not laughing at manner. How ill you are! What is the cause of all this? Do not ask me, cried I, putting my hand before my eyes, for I thought I saw the dreaded spectre glide into the room. He can tell. Oh, save me, save me! I imagined that the monster seized me. I struggled furiously and fell down in a fit. Poor Clovel! What must have been his feelings? A meeting which he anticipated with such joy, so strangely turned to bitterness. But I was not the witness of this grief, for I was lifeless, and did not recover my senses for a long, long time. This complement of a nervous fever, which confined me for several months. During all that time, Henry was my only nurse. I afterwards learned that, knowing my father's advanced age and unfitness for so long a journey, and how wretched my sickness had made Elizabeth, he spared them this grief by concealing the extent of my disorder. He knew that I could not have been more kind and attentive nurse than himself, and, firm in hope that he felt of my recovery, he did not doubt that in deed of doing harm, he performed the kindest action that he could towards them. But I was in relatively very ill, and surely nothing but the unbounded, unremitting attentions of my friend could have restored me to life. The form of the monster of whom I had bestowed existence was forever before my eyes, and I raved incessantly concerning him. Doubtless my words surprised Henry. He at first believed them to be the wanderings of my disturbed imagination, but the persistency in which I continued recurred to the same subject persuaded him that my disorder indeed owed its origin to some uncommon and terrible event. By some very slow degrees, and with frequent lapses that alarmed and grieved my friend, I recovered. I remember the first time I became capable of observing outward objects with any kind of pleasure. I perceived that the fallen leaves had disappeared, and the young buds were shooting forth from the trees, and shaded my window. It was a divine spring, and the season contributed greatly to my convalescence. I felt also sentiments of joy and affection received in my blossom. My gloom disappeared, and in a short time I became as cheerful before I was attacked by the fatal passion. Dearest Cable, Curvel, exclaimed I. How kind, very kind, good you are to me. This whole winter, instead of being spent in study, as you promised yourself, has been you consumed in my sick room. How shall I ever repay you? I feel the greatest remorse for the disappointment of which I have been the occasion, but will you forgive me? You will repay me entirely if you do not decompose yourself. But get well as fast as you can, and since you appear in such good spirits, I may speak to you on one subject, may I not? I trembled. One subject? What could it be? Could he allude to the object whom I dare not even think? Compose yourself, said Clerval, who observed my change of color. I will not mention it if it agitates you. But your father and cousin will be very happy if they received a letter from you in your very own handwriting. They hardly know how ill you have been, since and are uneasy at your long silence. Is that all, my dear Henry? How can you suppose that my first thought would not fly towards those dear, dear friends whom I love, and who are so deserving of my love? If this be your present temper, my friend, will you perhaps be glad to see a letter that has been lying here some days for you? It is from your cousin, I believe.